took an end, at least temporarily. But I'd like very much, if I may, to welcome you all to the Australian Human Rights Commission and to launch this wonderful report, the Social Justice and Native Title Report. My name's Gillian Triggs. I'm the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and I'm delighted to see so many of you here at this very busy time of the year. Before we start the formal parts of the launch, can I point out that it will be filmed and photographed today, and if you're not happy and do not consent to being filmed or photographed, could you please put your hand up? We'll make sure that the cameras don't stray too close to you. So please do make that known. And may I then, of course, begin by asking Yvonne Weldon to give her welcome to country. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. My name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman, originally from Cowra, New South Wales. I am the elected chairperson of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, and I am a representative on behalf of the Gadigal elders who could not be here with you today. I bring a message of acknowledgement of the people and the land of the Eora Nation. I bring a respect and recognition of the Eora Nation's cultural identity, promoting a vision for working together as one community and achieving as one community. I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people here today. The Eora Nation's country covers the Hawkesbury River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Gadigal elders, I welcome everyone to Gadigal land, and I acknowledge the Gadigal people whose spirits and ancestors will always remain with this land, our Mother Earth. My people, the Aboriginal people, have been a part of this land for more than 60,000 years. We're the oldest living culture of the world, and we will continue to maintain our culture and our practices for another 60,000 years at least. To give honour and respect, could you all please pause for a moment to reflect and remember the many men and women that have gone before us, the ones that walk beside us, and others soon to be following in our footsteps. Let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey together, walking forward for us all. May my people guide you and walk with you as you bring about positive change. Thank you and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's wonderful to have you here with us and wonderful to have that very warm acknowledgement. Well, my job is a relatively small one. To begin, to introduce Mick Gooda to you, who clearly needs no introduction. He's the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, and he's been one of the great colleagues of mine at the Commission and of all of the staff. We love working with Mick and have so much respect for the quality of the work that he's done. He has a lot of jobs to do under his statute, but one of them every year is he has to produce a report. And this is the 6th report that Mick is making to Parliament. And I will, of course, leave it to Mick to discuss that report in detail. But what I do want to say is that in recognising and protecting the distinctive rights of Australia's First Nations peoples is an integral part of the work of the Commission. And indeed, it really covers so much of the work we do, because on every human rights issue that we consider, sadly, our First Nations peoples tend to be disproportionately represented. So Mick's work covers the field. This report does in particular cover an issue that Mick will talk about in detail, but children in out-of-home care. And it's now been 18 years since the Bringing Them Home report. And I managed to find a copy just to raise with you today, because this is our most cited and requested report at the Commission. And I think it's time we printed another one. You can see this is one quite literally falling apart. But it's been one of the most seminal, pivotal and important pieces of work that we've ever done. But rereading parts of it, as I was today, reminds me of how many of the issues are simply not yet addressed, how they are simply repeated over and over again. And one of them that concerns us all at the Commission, and certainly me as President, is the level of incarceration of Indigenous Australians. This was a problem a long time ago, and it continues to be a problem today to a level that's really disgraceful. And I thought that I would read, if I may, very briefly from Mick's report, and it deals in particular with a man, Kumanjayi Langdon, in the Northern Territory, who died in incarceration. And this is what the coroner had to say. Kumanjayi Langdon, a sick, middle-aged Aboriginal man, was treated like a criminal and incarcerated like a criminal. He died in a police cell which was built to house criminals. He died in his sleep with strangers in this cold and concrete cell. He died of natural causes and was always likely to die suddenly due to chronic heart disease. But he was entitled to die in peace, in the comfort of his family and friends. In my view, he was entitled to die as a free man. And I think it's a very powerful statement. It's the right to die freely with your family that is so distorted by our policy of, unfortunately, arresting and holding in prison cells. And a young woman, of course, Ms. Du, is also being considered by the coroner's report in Western Australia. So the problems that were outlined so profoundly and accurately in the Bringing Them Home report are, of course, being addressed by Mick today. So please join me in welcoming Mick to talk about that report.
Thank you, Gillian. And Yvonne, thank you for your lovely welcome to country. I too acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional owners of the land where we gathered, and where the offices of the Australian Human Rights Commission is situated. On behalf of the Commission, can I thank the Gadigal people for hosting us as guests on their country. The law that establishes the Commission gives us a number of statutory responsibilities. And as Gillian said, one of those responsibilities is the reports we're launching today. We honour the Gadigal people, indeed all Indigenous Australians, by doing our utmost to shine a light on the human rights of our people each year and to report on native title matters. This is an important part of the work of the Commission, but we're also focused on the practical and long-term solutions to human rights facing Australians more generally, and building a greater understanding and respect for human rights in our community. Today, I pay my respects to the Gadigal elders who have gone before us, those who are here today, and importantly, those who are yet to come. I'm really pleased to see so many young people here today. You are the achievers, advocates, leaders, and elders of the future, and I welcome you warmly. My people are the Gungaloo people of the Dawson Valley in central Queensland, and I bring greetings and salutations from my elders. I have a long list of people to acknowledge, so bear with me. Of course, our President, Professor Julian Triggs, Susan Ryan, the Commissioner for Age and Disability Discrimination, Tim Wilson, the Human Rights Commissioner, Chairperson of the First Peoples Disability Network, Gail Rankin, and CEO of the First Persons Disability Network, Damien Griffiths, Native Title Tribunal member, Dr. Valerie Coombs, Rod Little and Jackie Huggins, co-chairs of the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, Jeff Scott, the CEO of Congress, Rosalind Croucher, President of the Australian Law Reform Commission, Warren Mundine, Chair of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, Bobby Campbell, First Assistant Secretary, Indigenous Health Division at the Australian Department of Health, Professor Shane Houston, Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the Sydney University, Justin Mohammed, CEO of Reconciliation Australia, Janine Mohammed, CEO of the Congress of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Nurses and Midwives, Richard Weston, CEO of the Healing Foundation, Kevin Smith, CEO of Queensland South Native Title Services. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and teachers across New South Wales attending the biannual Aboriginal Studies Conference present here today, and also tuning in by webcast. I must also mention the passing of a dear friend and colleague, Brian White. Brian was a warrior. He was a great support to me, both personally and professionally, and we miss him. I pay my respects and gratitude to the staff at the Commission, whose hard work brings reports like this to life. Kirsten Gray, Emily Collette, Susan Nicholson, Darren Dick, Andrew Gargett, Jack Register, Roxy Moore, Amber Roberts, Ali Campbell, Lockie Ball, Sabone Tierney, the Commission's legal and investigation and conciliation sections. I thank you for all of your professionalism, commitment to the work that we do. And one final special thanks today must go to Phoenix Briscoe, whose beautiful face is on the cover of our report. So thank you, Phoenix. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for joining us here to launch the 2015 Social Justice and Native Title Report. We proudly continue the tradition of former commissioners of our reports providing a platform for some of the most pressing issues faced by our peoples. This year, I'm very pleased to have made disability in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and the situation of our children in out-of-home care the focus of this report. I'll come back to these matters later, but I would like to mention a number of other important issues that impacted on us in the period from 1 July 2014 to 30 June 2015. I begin by reflecting on the events surrounding one of our most accomplished sportspersons and strongest human rights advocates, respected leader, anti-racism campaigner, award-winning footballer, and former Australian of the Year, Adam Goodes. Adam was subjected to some of the most spiteful racial vilification this country has seen, conveniently disguised as booing. But sport has always been a metaphor for our struggles, from tennis to hockey, track and field, boxing, basketball and golf. The list of sports where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have reached great heights goes on and on. And the football field is no exception. Our men and women have taken to the field in all codes with great success. This year in the AFL and NRL Grand Finals, Cyril Rioli and Jonathan Thurston, both proud Aboriginal men, won the Norm Smith Medal and Clive Churchill Medal, respectively, for the best on ground. And I can't forget Kaya Simon scoring the goal that knocked Brazil out of the Women's World Cup earlier this year. But it remains a great shame of this nation that this success is not always celebrated in the way it should be. In the great tradition of men like Charlie Perkins, Michael Long and Nicky Winmar, Adam spoke up against racism on the field. In an exercise of leadership in his area of expertise, he proudly expressed his cultural identity in his workplace, the football field, and he refused to be subjected to racial abuse while on the job. I reflected on Adam's example this year when I was honoured to be invited to present the Charles Perkins Oration. I was recalling my memories of working with Charlie, and it cheered me up a bit to think of what he might have said to both supporters and detractors. Charlie, like Adam, was the constant target of all kinds of abuse for the simple reason of calling out unfairness, advocating for our mob, and not taking a backward step in both his sporting and professional lives. But he never let it stop him. And he had some pretty strong words to anyone who wouldn't see reason. So Adam, for giving us great hope and inspiration, I take this opportunity to pay my respects to your incredible sporting ability and humility as a campaigner against racism and an advocate for constitutional recognition and reconciliation. As I reviewed other significant events of the year, I looked through the lens of meaningful and respectful engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. These events included the impact of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy round on our organisation and peoples, the proposed closure of communities in Western Australia, the so-called introduction of the so-called paperless arrest powers in the Northern Territory that has disproportionately impacted on our people, and that paragraph in the report that Gillian read refers to particularly that paperless arrest matter. And of course, the drift on constitutional recognition. I ask the question, what would these issues have looked like if there had been real engagement in the development of these policies? Perhaps if the government had included us in the decision-making process, a lot of the problems, anger and uncertainty that arose over the past year could have been avoided. And the time and energy we had to put in fighting to have our voices heard could have been better directed towards getting on with the work of improving outcomes for our people. The cumulative effect of these and other developments throughout the years has been enormous confusion, stress, and poor outcomes for our communities. The effect was certainly front and centre in the upheaval and uncertainty felt by our people as they came to terms with the impact of the introduction of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, and along with that, significant budget cuts. I had hoped that despite the tumultuous origins of the IAS, it might result in much needed flexibility in the delivery of frontline services to our communities. Unfortunately, these hopes have not materialised, and a review of IAS is currently underway. I remain hopeful, however, that if the review can prioritise real engagement, it may yet present more optimistic outcomes. An area where we have seen positive change is in the progress made of recognising the rights of First Peoples with disability. I would like to acknowledge that yesterday we celebrated International Day of People with Disability, and I extend my thanks to Gail and Damien for coming to speak with us later on here today. For too long, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability have been overlooked, despite the fact that our mob experienced disability at nearly twice the rate of non-Indigenous Australians. It has taken an enormous amount of dedicated advocacy by people like Damien and Gail to get the issues confronted by our people with disability, their families, carers and communities on the agenda of the policymakers. However, as you'll read in my report, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is now in the process of being rolled out. Those of you who have followed my time in this position will know that I have constantly and consistently agitated for proper, respectful relationships between governments and our peoples, communities and organisations. And I now say this to the leaders of the NDIS. As the NDIS, as the National Disability Insurance Scheme offers a completely new way of doing business, I implore you to build a respectful relationship with our people with disability. You now have a unique opportunity in front of you to engage with our communities in the right way, right from the beginning, and ensure the rights and aspirations of our people with disability are recognised and they receive the services to which they are so entitled. In this year's report, we also highlight the overrepresentation of our children and young people in out-of-home care. Several years ago, I was asked to write the foreword to a book on child development and took an approach to this task from an innocence perspective. To paraphrase, I wrote that our duties as adults was to protect the innocence of our children for as long as possible. Because once lost, all the gold and money and effort in the world will never bring innocence back. But when we see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are approximately 9 times more likely to be in out-of-home care than non-Indigenous kids, too many of our children are losing their innocence too early. Keeping our children safe from harm should always be our first priority. But the very high numbers of our kids who are being removed from their families and communities suggests that the greater efforts are needed to break this cycle. This includes investment in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander childcare agencies, the development of targets, prioritising community-led healing and trauma-informed approaches to protect our children. The importance of our people taking a leading role in addressing these issues cannot be overstated. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples recognises our right to be included in decisions that affect us. The Declaration should guide the development of all policies, legislation and programs that concern Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Its key principles of self-determination, participation in decision-making, non-discrimination and equality, and respect for and protection of culture provides guidance on how to fully realise the human rights of our people. As many of you may already know, last month Australia appeared before the United Nations Human Rights Council for its second Universal Periodic Review. This process provides UN member states with the opportunity to assess the human rights records of other nations, providing an important opportunity for creating a dialogue between nations about human rights. I travelled to Geneva as part of the Commission's delegation for Australia's UPR process. And I say this to people out there who question the value of international engagement for us. I urge you to take some comfort in knowing that of about the 110 countries that spoke for 1 minute and 5 seconds at the UPR, some 70 of those used their precious time to mention the issues about the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. The Universal Periodic Review highlights the value of dialogue in promoting and protecting human rights, and as it matures, I feel the UPR presents one of the most effective UN mechanisms to keep Australia to account. In this year's report, I also consider the Australian government response to the Forest Review, its recommendations on Indigenous employment, training, and in particular, the introduction of trials of the Healthy Welfare Card. There is little supporting evidence that the Healthy Welfare Card could result in real benefits for disadvantaged communities, and it is very likely to have a disproportionate negative effect on our people. We cannot successfully address social disadvantage through measures that diminish our ability to enjoy and exercise our human rights. This year I was asked to chair the Queensland Stolen Wages Reparation Task Force, which is charged with distributing $21 million as a gesture of reparation and reconciliation for one of the most ruthless breaches of our human rights, the stealing of wages and social security payments from our people up until 1971. Like many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across the country, our people in Queensland had their wages stolen and used by the government for a host of public purposes, usually quite unrelated to the people who earned the money in the first place. Successive Queensland governments have grappled with how to repay that money and make restitution for the harms done by those policies. At the same time the task force was going about its work, we saw a debate in our national parliament around a new mechanism to gain control of Aboriginal people's money, the so-called Healthy Welfare Card I mentioned earlier. The current trend toward management of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's income is worrying on two fronts. Firstly, while there's no doubt many disadvantaged Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would like support, the evidence whether income management provides the support is mixed, to say the least. And secondly, any possible benefits must be weighed against the sense of disempowerment people report, the stigma they feel, and the punitive perceptions this plants into the Australian psyche about our people. The Healthy Welfare Card is not exactly identical to income management, but it imposes restrictions on the way people can spend their money, and like I said before, will almost certainly impact disproportionately on our people. It is also not identical to the regimes that stole people's wages and social security payments. But with those regimes still fresh in our collective memories, it's no wonder that this card concept reopens old wounds and forces many of our people to revisit that past trauma. Even though these so-called trials are being rolled out in Ceduna, South Australia, and in Kununurra in the East Kimberley of Western Australia, as I said in my 2010 National Press Club address about the Northern Territory intervention, I believe that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people always feel a sense of solidarity, a sense of belonging to each other that is strengthened when some of us are being denied the rights that all other Australians enjoy. The emergency response, therefore, with the suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act, made us all feel as if we were subject to its effects regardless of where we lived. And I also believe the impacts of these new welfare policies will resonate for our people around the country. The hardest part, though, of this proposal is that yet again the treatment of our people will be different to mainstream Australia. And when told of the likely passage of this legislation, I rhetorically question, why are all the nasty policies around welfare always imposed on us? Why are our mob subject to the experiments dressed up in the benign language of trials and pilot projects? And when I thought about this in the context of the current historical policies, I came to the conclusion that's hard to avoid. Successive governments seem to have an ongoing fascination with controlling our lives. An approach which is in direct contravention to the human rights principles of self-determination, participation, and my ongoing recommendation to governments to engage with us. In my work with the Stolen Wages Task Force in Queensland, I've been listening to the stories of our old people about some of the worst periods of control, and was prompted to revisit Dr. Valerie Coombs' PhD thesis titled "Free the Blacks and Smash the Act." Dr. Coombs writes about the effect of the 1965 Aborigines and Torres Strait Islander Act, a law passed in hers and my early life in Queensland. The law represented a shift to the policies of assimilation with an ongoing framework of control. Dr. Coombs describes a view of the politicians at the time, particularly the Queensland Minister for Education and Aboriginal Affairs, who argued that this act was needed to maintain control over our people, adding that if the Queensland government failed to maintain that control, the courts would have no alternative but to send us to jail. Whatever the method, the act or criminal justice, the minister assured the public that the state had Aboriginal people firmly under its control. He justified the restrictive impact of the 1965 Act, arguing there was always a certain proportion of Aboriginal people who, by the virtue of their ability and circumstances, needed to have their money and property managed by government or its agents. The language and policies of government from over 50 years ago, where the restrictions on the fundamental human rights are framed as benevolent or benign activities, is sadly familiar today. In 1966, the director of the Queensland Department of Aboriginal Affairs, Patrick Coloran, described the Act as the most significant development in Queensland with regards to Aboriginal and Islander affairs that will promote the well-being and further progressive development of all Aboriginal inhabitants of the state. Dr. Coombs sums up the Act and the way it was presented to voters as showing the Queensland government's need to convince the public that in Queensland, the savages of the colonial world were under the absolute control of the sovereign power. Of Coloran's characterisation of the Act as a way to improve the lives of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples with the assimilation-based Act, Dr. Coombs wrote, "Clearly, government bureaucrats were either overly optimistic or seriously misinformed." Revisiting Dr. Coombs' thesis reminded me of what I described in the 2014 Social Justice and Native Title Report as the circular nature of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy. But the work of the task force has taught me how we as a country have not recognised and learned from the failures of past policies, and we keep going around in those circles. As the saying goes, you can put lipstick on a pig, but at the end of the day, it's still a pig. We need to learn from the lessons of the past, develop evidence-based policies that support human rights and are based on real engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. One area where our people have taken the running is the emergence of new conversations around the Indigenous estate. It has been apparent for some time that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are frustrated with the existing native title and land rights system and the barriers that inhibit our enjoyment to our rights and interests in land, water and resources. These barriers and the need for reform are addressed in part by several government processes announced or completed during the reporting period. They include the Council of Australian Government's investigation into land administration and use, the Australian Law Reform Commission report on the Native Title Act, and the White Paper on Developing Northern Australia. In May this year, my colleague and Human Rights Commissioner Tim Wilson and I convened a roundtable on Indigenous property rights in Broome. This roundtable brought together a diverse group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to discuss how we can overcome the obstacles and leverage our property rights within the Indigenous estate to further our economic development opportunities within our communities. A number of key challenges that face us were explored, particularly when it comes to the full realisation of our rights under various native title and land rights legislation. We considered the nature of the rights and interests in land, the specific barriers to economic development, access to the finance needed to undertake projects, ways to grow specific business skills to support development, the long-standing issue of compensation for extinguishment of native title, and the international principle of the right to development. Next Monday, Tim and I will again convene a meeting and plan the next steps in the process. We hope that this will create a framework to advance a new dialogue between government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples about traditional land, a dialogue led by us that respects and values our knowledge and rights. These are the kinds of conversations that need to take place to produce effective strategies for closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. My final reflection on this last year is to share with you the pride I felt at being asked by the families of our legends, three of our legends, to present the Rob Riley Lecture in Perth, the Eddie Mabo Lecture at the Native Title Conference in Port Douglas, and as I mentioned earlier, the Charles Perkins Oration in Sydney. This was at once both overwhelming and humbling. But I've talked today a lot about control and the ways in which our rights are restricted. But in closing, I want to focus on some of the inspiration I take from the experiences of delivering those three lectures and from the lives of those great Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men. And as I make these closing remarks, I'm thinking about the examples of leadership they give to the young people here today, and perhaps to the not so young amongst us. When I was invited to give the Charles Perkins Oration, I was challenged to answer the question, whose voices shape reform, politicians or other people? In answering the question, I thought about my own memories of the lives of Rob, Eddie and Charlie, three men inextricably linked by both circumstance and nature. The circumstances were the beginning from which they rose. They all had harsh upbringings, having experienced the worst of the assimilationist era in this country, particularly when Rob and Charlie were taken from their mothers and put in awful places like Sister Kate's in Perth and the bungalow in Alice Springs. But if there was another circumstance that brought them together, was the struggle for land rights. Rob was at the forefront of the fight for land rights in Western Australia, particularly at Nookambah. And when the WA government led the resistance to the national land rights legislation, Rob Riley was front and centre. In my tribute to Rob, I mentioned how losing that fight for national land rights lit the fires for what was to become the fight for native title, leading to the High Court decision championed by Eddie. Charlie was there, sometimes at odds with other parts of the leadership, but nonetheless still fighting for the best deal that could be reaped from that High Court decision. But it was also their nature that binds them together. It was as if those harsh beginnings built the fires that steeled them for the future battles they would endure and gave them the strength to thrive. Fierce, leader, warrior, fearless, sons, fathers, grandfathers and inspirations, never taking a backward step and never shying away from the fight for the underdog. These are my enduring thoughts when I hear those names. So in the battle about who shapes reform the best, I believe it is activists like Charlie, Eddie and Rob who set the agenda. It's the activists who really listen to the voices of their people, push the envelope, particularly when it comes to the disenfranchised and the disempowered. If not for Charlie arguing to the point of being suspended from his first public service position, for us to participate in decisions that affect us, would have some benevolent government invited us in? If not for Eddie's dogged determination to pursue his right to visit his homeland on Mer in the Torres Straits, would have some government voluntarily overturned the myth of terra nullius? And if not for Rob's fierceness in raising issues of racial tensions, police brutality and discrimination, would we have ever heard of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody? Adam Goods' story is still unfolding, and I'm sure he will continue to set the bar high in the struggle against racism and promoting respectful relationship in our nation. What we know today is that he stood tall and proud despite public opposition and what I consider half-hearted support from the AFL. I've talked about men today in the context of the lectures I've given this year, but there are so many women who have paved the way for positive change in the face of resistance. Strong women like June Noska, Valerie Coombs, Jackie Katona, Marcia Langton, Larissa Brent, Benita and Gail Marbo, Gracelyn Smallwood, and our own Robin Quiggin, to name a few, all of whom have felt the full force of opposition from the media, public and private institutions, industry and interest groups, but they have remained staunch in their beliefs, have refused to be controlled and continue to express themselves as proud Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. So today, can we pay tribute to these men and women who have inspired a generation? And I hope they continue to inspire generations to come. By speaking up, they encourage us to do the same. They encourage us to speak up against discrimination, to tell our history, express our identity, and insist on a voice in Australia's laws, policy, economy, and cultural life. They challenge the status quo expected behaviour of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of being seen but not heard. They have refused to be controlled. And as the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples puts it, these men and women encourage us to speak up for principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination and good faith. Friends, today I'm proud to present you with the Social Justice and Native Title Report 2015.
Thank you very much, Mick. One of the primary focuses of Mick's report is this time on disability amongst the Indigenous Australian population. So it's very appropriate that we have two wonderful speakers, Gail Rankin and Damien Griffith, to speak about two rights don't make a wrong, safeguarding the composite rights of First Peoples with Disability. And can I ask Gail and Damien to come to the podium? Thank you.
Yep. My name is Gail Rankin. I am a strong Ngarrindjeri woman from the Coorong area of South Australia, and I'm also the founding chairperson of First Peoples Disability Network Australia, and recently elected chair of the Indigenous Persons with Disability Global Network, which covers the 7 identified geopolitical regions of the United Nations. I would like to acknowledge the land on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders, past and present. I would also like to thank Gillian Triggs, President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and Mick Gooda, Social Justice Commissioner, for the opportunity to speak today. First Peoples Disability Network has its roots in a discussion which took place in Alice Springs some years ago. And here I would like to acknowledge Uncle Brian Butler and Uncle Lester Bostock, whose vision was the beginning of our story. Since its inception, FPDN has struggled for its rightful place in the disability movement in Australia, in particular in the Aboriginal movement. We truly understand other priorities like health, education, housing and legal services, and we do not begrudge these services. In fact, we welcome these initiatives to be inclusive of our people with disabilities. FPDN has managed to overcome many barriers for the establishment and implementation of this network. The first and foremost is the financial support needed to establish ourselves. We were operating literally on a smell of an oily rag, so to speak, but through determination of a few dedicated people and the support of other non-Indigenous disability networks, we succeeded. And I would like to acknowledge at this point to thank People with Disabilities Australia for their in-kind support during these difficult periods. We at FPDN would also like to thank and acknowledge the Australian Government for their support and recognition of FPDN as the peak body for our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities and their family carers. First Peoples Disability Network is unique in itself. All founding board members are people with disabilities or family carers. Nowhere else in the world is there such a network established where all staff and board members are Indigenous persons, i.e. Aboriginal and or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a disability and family carers. We are well recognised in the international arena at the United Nations and other international disability advocates. Having said that, there is much more work required within Australia to bring our people to an equitable level as non-Indigenous persons with a disability. The rollout of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, NDIS, is a focal point at the moment in time, and we are continuing to work with government to bring this to fruition for our people. But there are many areas where it fails our people, and this is clearly evident in our ongoing conversations in the remote and traditional communities where there is no equivalent word for disability in any traditional language, and the terminology used is especially confusing, where English is second, third, or maybe even fourth language. The Australian Government must adhere to the 8 principles of the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability when making policies and decisions of what is best for our people. For far too long, decisions have been made without consultation, and the information gathered is used against our people, causing a lot of mistrust. As a person with a lived experience of disability, I totally comprehend how dysfunctional the system has been, and it's always a hard slog for anyone with a disability, let alone if you're Indigenous, because you get the double discrimination of being black and discrimination of a person with a disability. And we face many barriers. And unfortunately too, also disability has never been an open conversation in the Indigenous communities. And it is a hard conversation. I've done that myself. And unless we all are aware of, what is happening out there, we need to pull together and talk about this in a collective way, which will enhance the lives of our people with disabilities. The Australian government doesn't have a great reputation with the human rights agendas, and unfortunately they have failed our people with their policies on disability, because their interpretations are solely their own specific interpretation, instead of using the true interpretations of what these articles and conventions are meant to do for our people. I'd like to thank you again for our time here and acknowledge all of those previous speakers. And I would like to pass on now to our CEO, Damien Griffiths. Thank you.
Thank you, Aunty Gail. Thank you to President Gillian Triggs, and thank you to Mick for your tireless advocacy for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I'd like to thank you personally for your support, and thank you on behalf of the First Peoples Disability Network for your advocacy for the rights of our people with disabilities. I'd like to thank Yvonne for her welcome to country, and also add my acknowledgement that we are gathered here today on Gadigal land. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters in the audience today. I'd also particularly like to acknowledge two of my elders, in Aunty Gail Rankin and also Uncle Lester Bostock, who I'm personally indebted to for their wisdom and guidance over many years. So thank you very much. If I could just take a moment to acknowledge some of my colleagues from the First Peoples Disability Network, and perhaps they could give a wave when I say their names, because they're very important people to know. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you and acknowledge my Deputy June Reamer, who works tirelessly for our people with disability. You inspire me, June. Also to my cousin Scott Avery, who continues to break new ground with his community-driven research into disability in our communities. Scott's around somewhere, there he is. Diane Brooks from the Aboriginal Disability Network New South Wales is one of the most positive people I've had the pleasure of working with, so thank you, Diane. Also like to acknowledge Sarah Irvine, who's brought a new level of professionalism to our organisation with her media connections and also with her positive energy. Thank you, Sarah. Also like to acknowledge Luke O'Connell and Ben Reamer, and our colleagues in South Australia, Nancy Bates and Warwick. I'd also like to mention Paul Calcott from Queensland, who's doing great work using art as a means of giving a voice to some of the mob with disability. And also to Jennifer Cullen, who's the sole Aboriginal representative on the Independent Advisory Council for the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge our Financial Officer, Laiha Wu. She's actually the boss of First Peoples. I think I am, but it's actually Laiha. So thank you, Laiha. I'd also like to say a big thanks to my partner, Kieran, and our two daughters, Ellie and Carla, who make big sacrifices for me to be able to do this work. So thank you very much. I'm immensely proud and honoured to be the CEO of the First Peoples Disability Network. I feel truly blessed. I want us to now take a moment to say a few words. By any measure, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities are amongst some of the most disadvantaged Australians. They often face multiple barriers to their meaningful participation within their own communities and the wider Australian community. Addressing the unmet needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability is one of the most urgent social justice issues in Australia today. As Mick said, for too long the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities have been largely overlooked. This is despite the fact that the prevalence of disability is significantly higher amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people than the general Australian population. Until recently, the prevalence of disability in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities has been only anecdotally reported. However, the 2011 Australian census concluded that at least 50% of our people have some form of disability or long-term health condition. This may actually be a conservative figure because it does not include a measure on the prevalence of psychosocial disability in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. The high prevalence of disability, approximately twice that of the non-Indigenous population, occurs in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for a range of social reasons, including poor healthcare, poor nutrition, exposure to violence and psychological trauma, the removal from family and community, substance abuse, as well as the breakdown of traditional community structures in some areas. Aboriginal people with disabilities are significantly overrepresented on a population group basis among homeless people in the criminal and juvenile justice systems and the care and protection system, both as parents and as children. Currently, most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities remain at the periphery of the disability service system. This continues to occur for a range of reasons, some of which are now well established. However, one factor that remains little understood is the reluctance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability to identify as people with a disability. This continues to occur for a range of reasons, including the fact that in traditional language there isn't a comparable word for disability. This would suggest that disability was an accepted part of the human experience. That is, that people were not labelled. Many parents are reluctant to identify their children as having a disability because they worry they may have their children removed. It is still the case that Aboriginal children are significantly overrepresented in the out-of-home care system. Furthermore, some Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities are reluctant to self-identify because they already experience discrimination based upon their Aboriginality, and they do not want to be given another label perceived as negative. This preference to not identify presents a fundamental barrier for the equal participation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities in Australian society. The First Peoples Disability Network argues passionately that for positive change to happen in the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability, that change must be driven by community itself. It cannot be imposed, implied, intervened, or developed, even if in well-meaning intention, by an external service system that the vast majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability have little or no experience of in the first place. In many communities across the country, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities have been supported and accepted as members of their communities. However, it is the resources to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disability that many communities lack. This year's Social Justice Report makes a number of critical recommendations, with the key focus being the National Disability Insurance Scheme. The National Disability Insurance Scheme has the potential, as Mick said, to bring profound change to the lives of many of our people with disability, but it is just that potential. There is a critical need for a standalone national Aboriginal local area coordination program and an urgent need for investment to enable a concerted outreach approach across the country to educate and inform Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with disabilities about their rights and entitlements under the NDIS. Before I finish, I wanted to raise the issue of indefinite detention of Aboriginal people with disabilities in prisons around Australia. This situation is a national shame, an extraordinary denial of the human rights of all people with disability who are indefinitely detained, with a disproportionate number of people with disability indefinitely detained being Aboriginal. It is extraordinary to contemplate that in Australia today, there are Aboriginal people with disability who have been in prisons for more than 10 years without conviction. We should be outraged. I do want to acknowledge some very recent developments, however, in this area. Just this week, the Senate has voted to hold an inquiry into indefinite detention of people with disability, and thank Senator Rachel Siewert for her advocacy to make that happen. And also acknowledge that the Australian government recently made a voluntary commitment to investigate this issue, a commitment they made a couple of weeks ago at the UN in Geneva. Finally, we at the First Peoples Disability Network are fundamentally optimists. We must be. Each of us have a deep love for our countries, and we believe that Australia can do so much better in promoting and protecting the human rights of some of Australia's most vulnerable people, Australia's First Peoples with disability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gail, and thank you, Damien. I, of course, heartily endorse those comments that one of the shocking aspects of the work that we do is uncovering, partly through our complaints process, the incidence of so-called administrative detention, large words for a horrifying phenomenon that people are held for many years, for many different reasons, without charge or trial, in a year in which we celebrate the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta. So thank you very much. They're very important comments. But I'd also like to finish my own role in this by saying, of course, this report is being tabled and talked about now right at the end of the year. But the report is based on good evidence, good research, and scholarship. It's written wonderfully clearly, and I know Mick's responsible for that, but so too are some of his wonderful staff who write good, clear English, which I'm very fond of at the Commission. But what it means, what I'm trying to say is, let's have this report read out in the community, understood by our politicians, and let's see it optimistically, as Damien has said, as an optimistic base for the work that we can go forward with next year. So thank you all very much. And now Mick would has the last word. He's got some people to thank. Thanks, Mick.
I really like our tradition of gift giving. So I'd like to, my final thing for the day is to give gifts of our covers that we turn into photographs to Gail. Thank you for Damien. Thank you. Damien, it was really. We had to practice what we preach and listen to the people with disability about what we wrote of this year in our report. And it was very important, Damien, the guidance you and Gail gave us in putting that report together. Gillian, for you. Phoenix, come out here. And as the way we do, particularly talking about looking up for our young people, as a model, we've got to give her a bunch of flowers. I think what we all try to do is make life in the future for our children like Phoenix so much better than the outlook looks now. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Join us for some morning tea. Well,